Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Broadland. And I'd like to begin by agreeing wholeheartedly with his point there at the end of his remarks, that we shouldn't accept fraud as a cost of doing business, and indeed the moral imperative for us to pursue fraudsters and any losses to the public purse as a result of fraudulent activities. Indeed, when we do come to a further discussion about taxation, and increase in taxation is even more important that any losses, as you described, are pursued with vigour, and those who commit fraud in such a way are brought to justice. I'd also like to thank the Shadow Chancellor for bringing forward this debate today, and I intend to keep my remarks very brief, Madam Deputy Speaker, by focusing on some of the starting figures that have been already raised in the debate. The foremost amongst which, of course, is the figure that around 26% of the public money unlawfully taken from COVID-19 schemes is likely not to be recovered by HMRC, meaning that some £4.3 billion of the total £5.8 billion that was stolen from COVID-19 support schemes will effectively be written off. Now, I think it's important to put these figures into some context, and in doing so, I'd like us to consider for a moment another large figure, that of £3 billion, which, at just over half the cost of the monies lost to fraud, is the cost of increasing working age benefits and pension credit by 6%, the likely inflation rate by April, rather than the planned 3.1%. For it begs the question of what the Treasury could afford, if it wished, to end the cost of living crisis, build towards our net zero transition, or indeed to honour promises to match EU regional funding for Wales and indeed the other parts of the UK that previously received them. The outrage and indignation that we've heard this afternoon is quite understandable, but I would say that the mismanagement of some of our public finances by the UK government should not come as a great surprise. One need only read some of the work of the Public Accounts Committee to understand that there are many examples of quite serious mismanagement of public finances. And I call to mind a report back in July 2020 by the Public Accounts Committee, which concluded that HMRC did not understand the impact of any of the UK's largest tax reliefs. Indeed, it actually found that between 2015 and 2020, HMRC didn't evaluate the effectiveness of the 10 largest tax reliefs supporting economic and social objectives. These unevaluated reliefs cost about £117 billion, or some 5% of the UK's GDP. So in that regard, you could argue that we've been very lax with our public finances for quite some time. And yet this sort of laxity doesn't always extend to smaller businesses. And indeed, I listened with great interest to the comments and the remarks of the Paymaster General in opening or responding to the debate. And I do accept the point that the need for speed, as has been discussed this afternoon, meant that there was always a risk of some fraud. I don't think it necessarily justifies a case to be said that there are no need for checks and safeguards for any of the schemes. But it does make me think of a few examples from Ceredigion, where I know of businesses that were in receipt of furlough money, or furlough funding rather, were entitled to it. It's accepted by HMRC that they were entitled to it, but due to some clerical errors with regards to the RTI submissions, they're now having to repay thousands of pounds that HMRC does acknowledge that they would be entitled to, but sadly they've fallen foul of some of the RTI submission rules. Now, one can accept that that is the case, those are the rules, but here are businesses that are being pursued for thousands of pounds, and then we see that there are potential for billions of pounds worth of fraud, so money that's been lost to fraud rather than a clerical error, potentially being written off. So it's very difficult for those businesses, Madam Deputy Speaker, to accept that they must be brought to task when others are getting away with it. Now, to conclude, we find ourselves facing a mounting national debt alongside a cost of living and climate crises, and I accept that the public finances are in a precarious position. But if the government seeks to convince us that it cannot afford greater support for in-need households or greater measures to tackle the climate crisis, that it must do more to recover the billions of pounds worth of public money lost to fraud, and to hold those who have benefited from unscrupulous deals to account. For as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, if it fails to do so, the government will have very little moral authority to increase tax on households and businesses in April. Diolch.